was just 5 years. We rotate hosts. I'm not. Art Costa sometimes does a show. We have a few others. Welcome to Thinking Green. I'm Rana, and before I introduce tonight's guest, I do want to make an announcement about an upcoming event that is on the community calendar but relevant to tonight's show. There will be a transit forum, Transit New London, on Friday, January 29th at the Radisson Hotel Ballroom. It's a place with great train access, so if you're coming from another part of the state, you don't have to get in your car. It'll be held from 10 to 2. And if you want registration information, you can go to the New London Landmarks website, newlondonlandmarks.org, all one word. So that's January 29th, and I hope to see you there. Now, my guest tonight is Dr. Norman Garrick. He's the director of the Center for Transportation and Urban Planning, I hope I got it right, at UConn. And we'll talk to him tonight about how transportation can make for a good city, how our city and some other cities have changed over the years, and maybe figure out some ways that our cities can change back in a better way. So welcome, Norman.
Thank you.
First of all, do you want to tell people what the Center for Transportation and Urban Planning is and how it got started?
Okay, our center, the Center for Transportation and Urban Planning at UConn, is what is known as a university transportation center. It's basically was started about 5 years ago as part of the last transportation reauthorization. And it's one of a number of centers around the country. And actually, it's up for renewal in the next bill. So, and we're looking forward to being renewed. But the idea of our center is one of very few centers of its kind, in that what we're trying to do is to restore the connection between transportation and placemaking and urban planning. Because for a long time, we have treated transportation as if it had nothing to do with place. And so we're developing the knowledge and expertise needed to restore the connection. And so ours is one of the few centers in an engineering school in which we're bringing in people with expertise in urban planning, in geography, in all the other things that are going to make place and going to make a connection between the land use and transportation.
So even among these transportation centers, the one at UConn is kind of unique.
Definitely, yeah. It's definitely one of the few in the country. I would say maybe 2 or 3 out of the 100 or so centers around the country.
Do you mostly deal with problems in Connecticut, or do you consult around the country?
No, I personally, I've worked all over the world. The center, our mandate is for projects on a federal level. So we're concerned with things happening around the country. But, you know, a lot of the problems are very, very local. The same kinds of problems we see here as we see anywhere else in the country.
Yeah, a lot of the
anywhere else in the world, because I'm originally from Kingston, Jamaica, and I know very well that a lot of the problems that we see there are similar to what we have in the Connecticut cities.
So a lot of the cities around the world have had the same kinds of issues around transportation, and
we have had the same response to motorization. And what is good is that there are cities, primarily in Europe, that have also, you know, they were going down the same track that we were going, but they stopped and said, wait a minute, what are we doing to ourselves in terms of focusing on getting people to move as fast as possible?
And here, unfortunately, most of the places where it stopped, it was only because they ran out of money, not because
That's true.
there was a plan.
That is true, but there were places that were very systematic, and there are places actually not very far. I mean, if you look at a place like Cambridge, Massachusetts, there were plans to build freeways right through the heart of Harvard Square, and they were very, very systematic. In fact, there's a movie that shows how it came about that they stopped the freeways, the Beltway around
Wow.
Boston, and while that was the first time that they were able to break into the trust funds for highways and use the money to build transit, and I think that's saved. That's why we have a Cambridge in the way that it is now.
Right, and if you look at Cambridge compared to some of the areas that did get built up in the Boston area, there's a huge difference.
Very, very big difference. One of the fascinating things about Cambridge is that there are less people driving to work now in Cambridge than in 1960.
Wow.
That is really, there are very few places in the country you can say that.
Now, you brought some slides, and I thought maybe if you go through some of the slides,
Okay.
and we can talk about the issues as they're illustrated.
So,
Tap the space bar.
Yeah, I think the computer is just sleeping. And it's on the cover is a picture of New London. I don't know, how old is that map of New London?
this is a map of New London, I believe, from 1880. I found it on the web, and it's, I think it's from the Historic Society. And basically it shows the structure of New London, and you can recognize some things, like the parade is still there.
It is?
The rail and the train station is not there anymore. But you understood that there was a very, coherent structure to New London, and the parade was where it is because it was the center of the city. And I thought it was very, very, a very elegant place, but also it shows some of the potential of the city, but also some of what was lost in the city over time.
And one thing that's interesting when we look at some of the old maps of New London is that a lot of the downtown areas were much more densely populated, both in terms of people living there and working there, than they are now.
It was more densely populated, and the big thing was that it was mixed use. And there's a movement called New Urbanism, which is trying to restore that character to urban places in America.
Which means overturning a lot of zoning. Which-
Zoning is a big problem, but the even bigger problem is the folks involved in transportation, big roads, fast roads, etc. But those are two very big. But also there are other problems, like the bankers. They don't know how to deal with mixed-use buildings. They don't know how to deal with mixed-use places. So there's a lot of institutional structure that needs to be overturned, that has begun to be overturned in order to start to restore that kind of character to places.
Okay. I think one thing you mentioned, the new urbanists. I noticed when you in your title, the fall and rise of New London,
Yes.
came from Jane Jacobs, of course, and she was one of the most famous, probably. And in New London, there's a group of us who have tried to kind of bring her principles to play here. I won't say we've been very successful to date, but we'll see.
Well, I think you are successful. I mean, if you compare New London to even Norwich,
Yeah.
you can see that you have made some strides. I mean, there are lots of cities that are on this road, and in Connecticut, the ones that are further ahead are New Haven, for example. But I think New London is catching up.
That's good, because New Haven was also one of the model cities in the 1960s that had a tremendous amount of destruction and
yes.
urban renewal.
That's correct.
Now, maybe we can go back to the slides. I went through them earlier, and they were pretty illustrative. I don't know if we can read the text or not, but we can try.
Well, I guess I'll have to read it.
Yeah.
Well,
We, yeah. Okay. We'll put
okay,
it-
so one of the things when I was putting this slide together was to talk about some of those forces that changed the structure of cities in America in the 1950s and 1960s. And one of the things I've been doing with one of my PhD students is actually to measure the changes that happened in these cities. So the changes we're talking about includes urban renewal, building freeways in the city, getting rid of on-street parking, widening streets, and all of those things basically started to change how the cities function. And it's happened so quickly, it's kind of amazing. So that's some of the things I wanted to show, just how quickly it happened.
I know you mentioned in one of your slideshows, and I don't know if it's on this one, how the FHA was a big destructive force.
Yes. Well, it's not in this set of slides.
Okay, we'll get to that later, and we can start talking about.
So basically what we were doing in the 1950s was to try to construct what is referred to as a modernist city. And this is it's a vision of planners like this gentleman, this French-Swiss architect, Le Corbusier, and one of his famous saying is that we must kill the street. So his idea was that we needed to go away from the idea of cities as being organized around streets. And we had this idea of streets that now were taken over by traffic, and then the city was separated from the street. So the modernist city, like this one or the one I showed earlier. In fact, the one I showed earlier was a plan for central London.
Oh, wow.
And I always point out that they had enough sense not to do it in central London, but it's exactly what we did in Connecticut. I mean, what we constructed with Constitutional Plaza, etc., in Hartford is exactly that.
Yeah, the
modernist city. And so it's really the model that was set up. And the model, if you go back to the slides, it's about really focusing on mobility. So it's the relation, if we think about the role of transportation in cities, before 1950s, the role of transportation was to provide access. And cities was all about access. How do you get to things? But we started going on this path where mobility became more important. And so we thought the important thing was to provide mobility. So the dismantling of the city, part of that was about making things move as fast as possible.
But not necessarily getting anywhere.
Exactly. Well, they were getting someplace, but not to the city, because why would you stop in a city that has been destroyed to make you be able to go through as fast as possible?
About a year ago, Todd O'Donnell, the owner of our local train station, was on the show. And one thing he mentioned was that the way our transit is now, wherever you're going, it's the last 2 miles that give you problems.
Yes.
You can go point to these hubs, but there's nothing there to give you access to exactly where you have to go.
That is exactly correct. Yeah, and part of why the cities thought it was so attractive to change their structure was that they had to be competing with places that were being developed in the suburbs.
Right.
The problem is that, in my estimation, there is no way a city can compete with a suburb by dismantling itself. And we've seen that over the last 50 years.
It has not been successful, although ultimately the cities might get the edge as the price of gas gets higher, and we can't just drive without any thought to the cost.
The point is that they are getting the edge, but they have to realize that what is important about cities is not mobility, is not free parking, is not all those things that you can get in the suburbs.
And parking, I'll write it down. That's something we'll get to later, too.
Okay, so one of the things that I looked at in this presentation are some of the places that did not go down this road. And one of the places is Copenhagen. And what I find fascinating about a city like Copenhagen is that it had a lot of the same problems. It was being overwhelmed by cars, by the call for more mobility, for more parking. But in the 60s, they said, that doesn't make sense for us. So you can see in 1960s what it looked like. And you can see, well, I'll get back to that statement, but you can see what that looks like now. A large portion of the center of Copenhagen is pedestrian oriented. So they got rid of the cars. They slowly changed the structure of the city, and it became a very livable city. And the reason I put up that slogan, "We're not Italians," is that that was the headlines in the newspaper in Copenhagen, where they suggested getting rid of cars and putting sidewalk cafes. And they said, "This is nonsense. We're not Italians. This wouldn't work." And now you go to Copenhagen, and that's what you associate Copenhagen with: people sitting around on sidewalk cafe. In fact, it's so popular in Copenhagen to have sidewalk cafes now. It's there for 8 months of the year. They try to extend the season more and more and more.
And that's hard to imagine because it gets cold there.
That's true. And then the other place I looked at was Zurich. And again, they had a very interesting take on what they needed to do. In the 60s, their planners told them that they needed subways. And so they needed more mobility. So they weren't going to facilitate cars as much, but they were going to put in freeways. And they said, no, we don't want freeways because freeways, firstly, it doesn't have access to all the shops and people and so on. But secondly, it would open up the road space, so they would get rid of the streetcar, and it would open up the road space for more cars on the surface. And so they rejected the freeway, and they decided to enhance their streetcar system. So it fascinates me for these cities because they made very purposeful decision to not go down the road that Hartford and New London and most American cities went down.
Looking at the pictures, I'm struck by how many people there are in the streets.
I took that picture in March, a very cold day in March, and it's just amazing to be in that city, 2003, and to see the people on the street. That's the kind of life. That's what a city is about, is people on the streets. And I also wanted to point out that this is not the stop. The people that said stop, we weren't going to go further. It's not just in Europe that this happened. It also happened in American places, and some of the places include. Let's see where we are. San Francisco. The plan for San Francisco was freeways everywhere. That was the freeway plan for San Francisco. And anybody knows San Francisco. You can't just imagine what a city is like. There's a freeway on both sides of Golden Gate Park, for example. Almost none of those freeways were built. And I would contend that that's one of the reasons that San Francisco is one of the most expensive cities, most valued cities in America now. But the other thing that is interesting about San Francisco is not just what wasn't built, and I just highlighted some of the heroes of that fight against the freeway in San Francisco, including a black city council person, supervisor, and some regular citizens. But what is interesting, and of course you mentioned Jane Jacobs, and she led the fight. There were, a lot of people don't know this either, but there were plans for like 4 or 5 freeways across southern Manhattan. Think of what Manhattan would be. And of course, she became one of the most prominent planners, well-known person involved in planning. But I also wanted to talk about Louis Mumford because he's really been an inspiration in terms of how I've started to think about transportation. And the reason is that he, in his book, The Highway of the City, he said that, he asked this question basically, and he said, engineers have not stopped to say, what is transportation for? What is transportation for? And he says something fascinating about this. He says, a good transportation system lessens the need for transportation.
Wow.
Transportation is not about moving people, it's about providing people with access so they don't have to move. And so we need to rethink how we consider transportation.
And I noticed that book was written in 1964 when it was very much against what the common belief was.
Right. It's interesting because a lot of people will say, well, nobody understood what was going to happen. if you read Mumford, he says this is what is going to happen. We're going to be destroying our cities. We're going to be creating sprawl, etc. So, there were voices, but we were so busy building and tearing down things that those voices were not listened to.
Yeah, that I know in New London, someone who lived through that period in New London, and we'll look at maps of New London in a little while, said, they had such great plans for New London. It's located halfway between New York and Boston, and people thought that on the way from New York and Boston, they'd come and the freeways would get people to stay in New London. And of course, the freeways got people to bypass New London.
Right, through the cities, yes. So let's see what's up. So, here's one of the pictures that that you shared with me of what New London looked like. Yes, this was in 1911, and so you get the structure of the city. And what's interesting about this is comparing it to what New London looks like now. And what is really surprising, shocking to me about this is the loss of so much of the city. And that's part of the problem, is the loss of all of that north end. But the other part is how the freeway separates the colleges from the rest of the city.
Absolutely.
And I think as we talk about how we start to deal with the future of New London, we have to think about how do we reconnect the different parts of the cities that have been severed.
The bridge that to Groton was originally supposed to be built a few miles north of New London itself in Quaker Hill, and it was a political deal. The person who was a town chairman, a very powerful man, owned a piece of land that he wanted the state to buy up to build the bridge. And so the bridge ended up smack in the middle of downtown. Yeah. And we keep hearing that the city is only 6 square miles. But then you look at all of the wasted space where all of the little mini highways going all through the north end of the city and the east end of the city in particular. It's so hard to know what to do with that land.
Well, I think there are models now of places that are trying to reconfigure. The most radical thing would be to get rid of the freeway, which is probably not going to happen in this case. But there are ways to reconfigure the ramps and so on that you can start to recover some of the land and also try to start to make those connections between places that have been severed.
Yeah, well, I-95 we're pretty stuck with, and the bridge.
Yes.
But, some of the other access areas just seem totally unnecessary.
It was a way of thinking that you had to make the traffic move as fast as possible. And I think there's a lot of reconfiguring that could be done to improve the situation. And I also did these, I got these from you, showing the center of New London. But what I wanted to show, this is from 1965, it wasn't just the freeway that destroyed the structure. You can see right in the very heart of your city how much was given over to parking. So the problem with freeways is not just that they take up space where they are, but the fact that they're bringing cars. And when you bring cars, you have to put them someplace. Cars take up much more space when they're parked than when they are moving. And so a lot of our cities was given over how much of the structure of the city was lost there. This is 1965. This is now, and you can see that the structure, the loss that we experienced in 1965 is basically what we're living with now. So it was like a surgical, a brute force that happened very quickly and that we have had to live with for a long, long time.
And I think we've become accustomed to it, and that's one of the obstacles that people, maybe because we lost the trolley and we lost easy ways to get downtown without hopping in our car. But you hear from people, they open a business and zoning requires them to have a certain number of parking spaces.
Yes.
And people expect free parking.
Yes.
But you're saying that that's not really the way.
I'm saying that a city like New London was built as a 1900 city just cannot survive if it's going to be providing free parking, maximum mobility. It was not built for that. This is a destruction of the city to try to think that you can compete with the malls in Waterford. You have to understand what you have to offer and to build and enhance those things and go from there if you're going to be successful.
And of course, New London, in some ways, in terms of businesses, has done a little bit of that. You know, we don't have big box stores in New London. We don't have a Starbucks, but we have, 3 or 4 good privately owned coffee houses. So I think for people who are looking for locally owned businesses, you'll find a lot more in New London than you will in the mall.
You'll find there's a lot more character here than most cities. I've enjoyed some of the coffee houses in town. Yeah.
Okay, we can go back to the slides and
Yes.
Hartford.
So I wanted to get to Hartford because Hartford is where I've actually done a lot of, doing calculations about what happened to these cities. This is Hartford in 1953, and this is the modernist city that was created just 13 years later. It's an absolutely different city. And you can see the modernist structure, the separation of the pedestrians from the traffic, etc. This, again, I show people that live in Hartford this picture and they said, what city is that? And I show them this. And this is that same city, and in just a few years later. The highways, the destruction for parking. And again, this is in the 60s, but this is the more or less the structure that we have now. So one of the things we did was we mapped the amount of parking in Hartford. This is the amount of parking in Hartford in 1960s. Surface lots, garages, underground parking, etc. This is today. This is, and when I look at this, I used to live in Hartford, and I never realized the sheer magnitude of the destruction. And you're always hearing people lamenting why Hartford is not doing better than it is. But when you look at this, you get some sense of just how much was lost. And I think Hartford is doing well, given the amount of destruction that occurred.
But you can see from that they've made a lot more room for the cars, and there's less room for the people in the businesses.
There's almost no room for the people. But what's ironic about this map is that a lot of the parking in that south end of the city is state-owned. That's the state government at work. I was just told over the weekend that there's the state contract, some state contract calls for parking within 700 feet of your desk. You're required to have free parking within 700 feet of your desk.
And then they'll have a new commission to figure out why everyone is obese, right?
But the interesting thing also about this study is that we found that the insurance company actually have very green policies. Like Travelers, almost 30% of their employees walk, bike, or take transit.
Oh, wow.
And the reason is they don't provide the parking, they subsidize parking, but they also subsidize transit, compared to less than 10% of state employees that walk, bike, or take transit. So, all the assumptions about these things, it turns up, is upside down from what we think.
Well, we've found here in New London, just from our own experience, that the policymakers at the state level mostly do not come from the cities,
yes,
and don't really understand the cities. And when they set some policy for us, we better watch out. And I hate to say that, but recently COG, the Southeastern Connecticut Council of Governments, which is the closest thing we have to county government, studied New London as a transit hub. And of course, we have water access, we have rails, we have buses, we have a bike initiative started. We could have everything. And I looked at a little piece of what this study said, And one of the concerns is, the state wants to take over the train station. The ferries can keep being privately owned, but they want to build pedestrian walkways, which once again takes the people away from the traffic. And in this case, people would have to be walking up 3 or 4 flights of stairs on the walkway because it's got to be so high it clears the catenary above the train tracks. And I looked at it, and these are supposed to be experts, and I'm not, but some of it just doesn't make sense.
Well, the assumptions are different because it's not about valuing the city. It's about providing mobility. So even though talking about train is a step forward, it's still a train where people are expecting that everybody is going to drive to the train station. Whereas when trains were built first in Connecticut, it was about making places around the train station. And that's what is the missing piece. So every time you hear somebody talk about train in Connecticut is how much parking are you going to build? So it's
That's
still
true.
about getting the cars, using the cars, and the train, okay, so that's going to help a little bit. But it doesn't make that leap, that change in culture that we need.
That people would live nearby. And yet we see that happening. My sister lives in Maryland, and every time they open a new metro stop, the housing just springs up right around it.
Yeah, it happens in Virginia, yes, some places in Maryland, but you have to work at it. There are places in Maryland that are absolutely horrible. They just have not gotten it either. I just wanted to, before we go on, to talk about what happened with parking. So parking total tripled in Hartford between 1960 and 2000, based on that map. We went from 16,000 to 45,000 parking spaces. But what fascinated me more than this was these figures which show the population decreasing, the employment decreasing. So you always get the argument that we have to do this.
We have more parking, but fewer people and fewer jobs.
And fewer jobs. So how does this make any sense?
And I bet those sort of statistics for New London would probably look comparable.
Very, very, very much, if not worse. Because I think it's worse in some of the smaller cities. At least Hartford has been able to maintain itself as an office hub.
Yeah, I know our population has dropped from the high 30,000s to about 25,000. So and when you look at each wave of urban renewal, every area targeted reduced the density of people and businesses.
Yes, and the density, the character, all of that. So, this is an interesting city. I have a colleague, the president of the Congress for the New Urbanism, and he always talks about this city. I don't know if you recognize this city. It's Detroit, Michigan. Oh. And he says that this is the only city in America that has solved the congestion problem. And how they did it was by basically destroying themselves.
Oh my goodness.
So you can see the loss of structure, the loss of fabric. And you go to Detroit. I went there for the first time last year, and it was sad. It has some of the most magnificent buildings, wreck in the country. Everywhere parking, huge roads, no congestion, but no city. And so that's how that's the end game, really, of a New London or a Hartford.
And in New London, we saw some, in the maps, we saw some of those shifts, the cul-de-sacs, and,
exactly.
Places that you really weren't quite sure what it led to. It's funny, you look at a grid and you can just imagine buildings and
the
businesses.
connections and the life and walking, and you look at those cul-de-sacs and you realize, you immediately know that this is a desolate place.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, but Detroit is the end game, and we really, I think a lot of planners need to go there and say, is this what we're really striving for?
And, what if we succeed?
Yes. Yes. John Norquist always shows pictures of Berlin. And he shows pictures of Berlin and he shows pictures of Detroit. And he says, which of these two cities was destroyed by World War II?
Yeah. Yeah, well, most of this development happened post-World War II, the character of the
Yes, I
city
mean, in
changed.
1945, Detroit was one of the richest cities in the world. And now you look at it and you do think that there was a bomb that went out there.
Wow.
I don't know how many more slides I have, but
I don't know. We'll look at the rest of them.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the end game also in the US are all of these kinds of sustainability problems. One of them is the fact that we're killing 42,000 people per year. When you compare us to countries that have gone in a different direction, we started out with the same rate of traffic fatality as the Netherlands 30 years ago.
That's not that long ago.
40 years ago. And we have totally diverged in terms of outcomes. So let me give you some real hard figures. So in 1970, 32,000 people died each year in the Netherlands. Now the number is down to 750.
Now, what did they do to lower their number?
They made cities that were more for people, for walking, for bikes. They have huge walking rates in places like Amsterdam. So they understood how to design roads that helped in terms of decreasing fatality, but also the fact that so many less people are driving. So the big difference in the US is that, as you know, the more driving you do, is the more people get killed. An example is that last year, only 37,000 people got killed in the US. The year before that, it was 42,000. The difference was that we stopped driving as much last year because of the economic crisis. Yes.
And the gas prices.
So, but that's just part of it. That's just part of the problem. So that's one of the things. Another sustainability problem that we have to look at is this graph that shows the growth in population in green. Let me see. The population doubled since 1945. The amount of driving increased by 11 times. And think about all that is embedded in this: greenhouse gas emissions, energy use. So we have created a situation where we need to be driving that much. It's not that we always say Americans love their car, but nobody loves their car that much.
Right.
What it translates to is we're now driving 27 miles per day per capita. 27 miles for everybody, every man, woman, child,
Wow.
baby, compared to 5 in 1945. And so, you know, it's ridiculous to say that people want to do this. Nobody wants to be able to have to drive that much. But we have created a situation where we are forcing people into a situation where they have to drive.
Yeah, a lot of those are probably commuting miles or miles to purchase what you need.
A lot of it is commuting miles, and in places like Atlanta, the numbers are almost 40 per day. And then compared to the Netherlands, to Norway, for example, and in this picture, I chose to compare to Norway because two things. Norway is one of the richest countries in the world, and secondly, Norway has much more oil than we do. And they had the good sense to realize that it didn't make sense for them to be burning their oil. It was better to be sending it to us and to the other places that needed it.
So they're getting rich off of our habit.
Our bad habits. So they had the sense to say that they were going to tax gasoline, for example, so that they would use their funds for other things rather than to be spending on traveling.
Now, in addition to taxing their oil, they've probably set up good mass transit.
Not just mass transit. I think you start with, and I think my belief is that you start with creating great cities, great places. Regardless of the mass transit, if you don't have great urban places, then you can't, it's not going to be comfortable to use transit. So you have to start there. So that's why a place like New London is so important as we start to think about the future. Because we were able to do all of this because gas was cheap, because we weren't concerned with greenhouse gases, etc. But we can't, as we go forward, I mean, the bomb that nobody's paying attention to is that gas is still $2.80.
Right.
In a recession. I'm thinking that as soon as we get out of this recession, it's going back to $5.
Well, and of course, it is going to get more and more expensive to both extract and transport it here.
That's true. That's very much. And so in fact, I would say our federal government under the current president has realized that, this is something that is not going to continue. So it's time. It needs Connecticut to get on the ball and understand how we can take advantage. We have so many advantages. We still have the basic structure of our cities, even though we have neglected them or treated them so badly. But New London, Norwich, Hartford are places that are going to be very important as we go forward.
And things are themselves kind of human scale more than some of the bigger cities and bigger states.
Very much, and it's also about where young people want to live. I mean, they don't want to live in the suburbs. That's why they don't stay in Connecticut.
Yeah, well, I think the suburbs are kind of boring too, compared to the city.
Well, some people want to live in the suburbs, but we don't all want to live in the suburb, and that was the fallacy that we had to live with for so long.
Yeah, and now I think people are starting to see the cities as desirable, but it's slow.
Well, it's slow, and I think there are places that are really ahead of us, ahead of Connecticut. I think we're really the land of steady habits.
So earlier, and I think you have some slides about this, you were talking about ways that you can reclaim some of the loss of vitality and reconfigure the roads. So now, I don't remember. I thought you had a couple of slides.
I will
left
check.
That might show.
I am not sure. Let's see.
What?
Okay, yes, okay. So this is from Chattanooga, Tennessee. Let me just go back one. Let's see. Yeah, so Chattanooga is an example of a city that is rediscovering the importance of access and trying to restore its city. And one of the things that they did in Chattanooga, this was this freeway along the waterfront, dividing the city from the waterfront. And there was a big debate in the city. And there were two basically body of thought about what they were going to do. And one was saying that, the highway is the lifeblood. And mobility is so important for the economic health of the city. So you have to expand the highway to fight congestion. There was no congestion on this highway, by the way, but that's another point.
It looks pretty sparse.
But the other...
Was this built in the 60s?
I would think so, yes. I don't know the full history of it, but the other body of thought was that walkability and access to the waterfront was extremely important and key to the economic and social health of the city. And what happened in Chattanooga was that this body of thought won over. And so this is what was planned for the waterfront in Chattanooga. And this is what was actually built. This was about 5 years ago. So this is an example of what is referred to as freeway teardown. And it's really changed the character of Chattanooga. This is a picture of a waterfront festival on that new roadway that would not have been possible in the past. And so the idea of restoring access is something that is catching all over the country. I don't know if I have any more, but that's just one example. But basically, what we're seeing is the idea that this reconsideration of what transportation is for, and the idea that it's about access, not mobility.
Now, you mentioned something, we talked a little about commuting and the number of miles that people commute.
Right.
And part of the problem with this, it seems to me, is zoning. What can we, mixed-use zoning is still frowned upon in many places.
Right.
What can we do? Do we just have to go to our state statutes or our city zoning departments?
Zoning is a local issue, and that's one of the disconnects. So it needs to be changed at the local level. And there are a number of towns in the country that have gone to something called the smart code. So instead of using use zoning, they have a zoning based on the form of the buildings. And it's, I think actually Hamden, Connecticut is one of the first places that have accepted this, that have gone along this route. So there has been development of methodologies to try to deal with zoning in a different way. And that's one of them.
Now, I just want to let people know we have about 7 or 8 minutes left, and if you have any questions or comments, feel free to call in. I know it isn't a lot of time. We will have our community calendar at the end, and don't just turn off because this is our last live show for a couple of weeks, so we kind of put in events through the first week in January. So what would you recommend we do in New London?
Well, I think you've made some good start. I mean, I think Bank Street is really great. The character of it, it still looks as if it's struggling. But it's, I think the city needs to figure out how you can start to support both the street level, which is commercial, and also the upper floors. If you start getting policies to get people living and working downtown, I think that's part of it. But also, I think from a transportation point of view, we need to reconsider a lot of the streets in New London. As I was mentioning, on my way into New London and going through the center, you come in, and it's a very unpromising off the freeway, and then you see this magnificent building, the Day building, which is there, but it's right next to this, what looks like a freeway. And then this road continues in this freeway-like form right through the center of your city. And there's no sense that there is a city, that there is life there. You're just being channeled to go through as fast as possible.
Absolutely.
So it's about trying to reconfigure your streets so that they feel like streets rather than highway. It's part of getting people to try to start using the place differently.
Now, people have talked about, as long as I've been here, the possibility of turning Bank Street into a two-way street. And the argument against it is always you need the parking spaces right in front of the stores. And you mentioned something about parking, and maybe you want to elaborate a little bit more what parking should look like in a city.
Well, parking on the street is great in the city because that's where people want to be. In terms of Bank Street, it might be possible to consider having parking on one side, and I think it would be useful to have it's often useful to have a two-way street system in cities. So that's a possibility to consider. But I think Bank Street does not suffer from having parking on it. Parking on the street we think does a lot of good. It's where people want to be, firstly. It helps to calm the traffic somewhat.
It does. It slows it down a lot.
Exactly. And so that's one of the big arguments for on-street parking.
Now, one thing you mentioned earlier, there was a problem, is free parking.
Yes.
So should we be putting in meters? Should we?
I absolutely don't think you should. A city can survive with free parking. I don't think a vibrant urban area. It's basically what you're saying is that our land is not worth anything, that nobody wants to visit us unless we give them the perk of free parking. And there's no city that's worth its salt. If you go to Northampton, they're not giving away free parking. Brattleboro, all the cities of your size that are vibrant in New England. They understand, they manage the parking, they charge for the parking, they use the monies from parking to enhance the city. And I think free parking is a sign of a city that is not doing very well.
Now, is there a way to well, I'm trying to think of chicken and egg. If we're not doing well, will people not come because they are paying for parking, or are we just sending the wrong message to begin with?
I think it's sending the wrong message, but I think you have to consider parking as something that you need to plan for. And one of the interesting examples that I know of is Pasadena, California, which probably people here think that is this very thriving city. Well, it wasn't thriving that well in the 70s. And one of the things they did was to implement a system of paying for parking in old Pasadena, and they used the money to fix up alleys. They had all these, abandoned, dirty looking rundown areas, and they used the parking money specifically for restoring the character. And now you go to Old Pasadena, you could never have thought that it had a period when it was not doing so well.
Well, we have 4 minutes left. So can you think of anything we've missed in this discussion that we don't want to forget about? And if you don't, I thought, well, right now New London has been approved for a pilot for land value
Right.
taxation.
Yes.
And have you ever seen where that's occurred in any other cities?
I've
and
heard
what kind
about
of
it. I'm not
impact?
that familiar. I've heard about it in some Pennsylvania cities.
Yeah.
And it's apparently been very, very successful. And it's really about how you value your land.
Yeah,
and,
it was the
and
parking
what
that
kind
got
of
me
things.
thinking about
Yes.
it.
And I'm very excited that New London is willing to try this experiment. I think it will succeed. But what it also tells me is that there are people here that cares about the city and are willing to try new things. And I think that's really is a sign that it's a city that is going to be able to pull itself out of this.
I hope so, because one of the big obstacles is we have people who are fixing things up, and then we have other people who are just letting their land
Yes,
lie.
yes.
And right now, the people who are fixing things up are the ones who have the burden of taxation.
Right.
And with land value tax, the burden would be shifted a little bit more towards those people who are
Right.
just neglecting.
Well, that's what I mean when I say that, there are policies to help people that are trying
Yeah.
to bring back life to your streets. And that's certainly one of them that should have some impact.
Well, in the last minute, is the Center for Transportation and Urban Planning open? If people want information from you, how would they contact you?
Well, if you go to our webpage, it's CTUP. Well, I don't remember what it is actually, but you can Google my name and CTUP. But yeah, we don't really have a big budget in terms of outreach, but I'm always, and my other colleagues are always willing to work and to help and to give advice to people that are looking to work on these issues. Because often, the problems that you are facing on the grounds are the one that is more fascinating for our students, and it enables us to do more interesting research and bring some real life problems and issues to the students.
Well, thank you so much for coming down to New London. Maybe we can make this an annual thing.
It's always my pleasure to be in New London. I love it here.
Me too.
Thank you.
Well, next week and the week after our holidays, we will be showing reruns. We'll be back live on January 7th. Andy Durr will be the host. I don't know what the subject will be, so tune in and be surprised, and have a great holiday.